This video is part of a series of tutorials on strength training concepts and is brought to you by Edgerton's Garage Gym. Types of strength. Maximum strength refers to the maximum amount of force an individual is able to produce. There are no constraints placed on this. When testing maximum strength, there should be no limiting time frame within which peak force needs to be achieved, for example. However, this factor, along with many other factors, does have an impact on the ability to produce force. Therefore, we do need to identify various different types of strength, which are defined based on the specific constraints or conditions under which force is produced. In this video, we will look at 3 different ways in which we can specify the conditions for force production. We will also take a look at the various subcategories of strength that this creates. So firstly, we can specify based on the type of muscle action. Concentric muscle actions are when the proximal and distal muscle attachments move towards one another. Eccentric muscle actions are when the proximal and distal muscle attachments move away from one another. Isometric muscle actions are when the proximal and distal muscle attachments do not move relative to one another. All 3 of these types of muscle actions are involved in most sporting movements to at least some extent. However, the relative importance of each type of muscle action does vary a lot between different sports and activities. For example, a track cyclist will predominantly be concerned with concentric strength, whereas a track and field sprinter requires high levels of eccentric strength in certain muscle groups. A good example of where isometric strength would be the primary factor determining the result would be in certain strongman events, such as the Hercules hold or Thor's hammer, since there is essentially no movement involved in these events. Secondly, we can specify based on movement velocity. In this instance, we are really talking about power, since an accepted definition of power is force multiplied by velocity. However, this concept of power can appear in several different forms. Namely, we've got mean power over a given interval, or we've got peak power at some specific instance. And we've also got power at any given instance. Research has been conducted on various exercises in an attempt to determine the optimal load in a given exercise in order to maximize power. For example, the dynamic output hypothesis states that we expect power to be maximized in the squat jump exercise when no external load is used at all, and the exercise is just performed using body weight only. However, in addition to having to take into account the different forms of power when looking at this type of research, we also need to ask the question of, just because a particular loading strategy maximizes power output in a given exercise, does it necessarily follow that this particular loading strategy is optimal when training for a particular sport or activity? Instead, is it actually possible that focusing on power development at specific movement velocities of greater relevance to a given sport or activity would be more beneficial, even if that means that the training loads are either greater or lesser than the optimal load for maximizing peak power or mean power? If we decide that the answer to this question is yes, then it's at this point that an additional 2 strength qualities come into play: speed strength and strength speed. Speed strength characterises the ability to quickly execute a movement against a relatively small external resistance. It can be defined as the ability to produce force at intermediate or high velocities, whereas strength speed can be defined as the ability to produce force at low velocities. This brings us onto our third way in which we can specify the conditions for force production. In this instance, instead of looking at movement velocity, we are now concerned with the time frame within which force is produced. This gives us the quality known as explosive strength, which is characterized by the ability to produce maximum force in minimum time and is calculated by dividing maximum force by the time taken to produce this force. However, just as we can have different forms of power, with peak power and mean power, speed strength and strength speed, we also have subcategories of explosive strength. These include starting strength and acceleration strength. Starting strength has been defined as the ability of the muscles to develop force at the beginning of the working contraction, before external movement occurs. It is calculated by dividing 0.5 F max by T 0.5, where 0.5 F max is half of the recorded peak force, and T 0.5 is the time taken to reach half of the recorded peak force. Acceleration strength is the ability to produce force during the late stages of the working contraction. Now, this is calculated by dividing 0.5 F max by the figure you arrive at by subtracting T 0.5 from T max. And T max is the time taken to achieve peak force, and we've already covered that T 0.5 is the time taken to achieve half of peak force. Now, there are additional subcategories of strength as well. For just one extra example, reactive strength is defined as explosive strength relative to body weight. This concept of relative body weight can be applied to power or to maximum strength as well. And so it goes to show that this is a far from exhaustive list of different types of strength. Just listed a few on this slide just so you can see: reactive strength, relative strength, strength endurance, power endurance, flexibility strength, strength skill, just to name a few additional strength qualities that we haven't even looked into yet, but the list does go on. If you found the information in this tutorial useful, please like the video. And for more information on sports science and strength and conditioning, please subscribe to Edgerton's Garage Gym.